Yeah, welcome to the session this morning on vaccine discovery, development and delivery. We have what I think must be the best possible panel in this world on this topic. We have Lynda Stuart, who is the Deputy Director responsible at the Gates Foundation for Vaccine Discovery and Development. We have Frederik, Kristensen, who is the CEPI Deputy CEO, Steve Davis, who is the President and CEO of PATH, Seth Bekrley, the CEO of Gavi, and Gayle Smith, CEO and President of WON. So we have an outstanding joint brainpower here to discuss issues regarding the discovery, development and delivery of vaccines. And as you know, on the path from discovery through clinical testing, development, down to population health impact and social and economic impacts that we can achieve with vaccines, which are of course one of the best things we can do in global health and public health. They're typically highly cost effective and highly feasible in their delivery, at least up to a point. We are facing many hurdles. At the discovery stage, we are facing market externalities. Transmission, of course, gives rise to powerful biological externalities. Communities that are vaccinated have less AMR, so we have community externalities at that level, and through an AMR mechanisms we have economic externalities because communities that have a high coverage of vaccine preventable diseases of childhood may have reduced child mortality and thus triggering demographic dividends and demographic transitions that lead to human and economic development. At the developmental stages and the production and supply chain stages, we have major issues because the production technologies are complex, they're capital intensive, and we need to ensure that the most resource poor countries and populations and communities globally have sufficient supplies of vaccines. At the health systems level, we have on the one side remote and rural population that we are still not reaching with our health systems, and we are not achieving high coverage levels even with some of the very old EPI vaccines. At the same time, on the demand side, we have an increase globally in distrust and lack of confidence in vaccines that are clearly efficacious and beneficial for communities and individuals. So we want to discuss in this panel a few of the innovations and mechanisms that are available to us to ensure that we are reaping the full potential population health impacts that vaccines through this chain from discovery to population health can provide us with. Gayle will start us off with a framing, and that's the only slide presentation that we will have. We will then go into a panel discussion, and then in the end hand over to you, our treasured audience, to ask questions, and please be interactive and do ask questions. From last year, I remember that the World Health Summit audiences are very active and challenging. So I hope we have a similar situation this year again. Thank you. Gayle.
Thanks very much, Till, for the introduction, and I just wanted to spend maybe 2 or 3 minutes just using a little bit of that time to frame some of the issues that I see, or some of the macro financial issues around vaccine R&D. So this is the aggregated data from of the amount of money the foundation invests in vaccines. And we invest very heavily in vaccines for exactly the reasons that Till articulated, because of their outsized impact on public health and wellness of those who live in poverty. So I think this is something I'm very proud of about at the foundation, is our real commitment to vaccines at large. However, if you actually look at vaccine R&D funding generally within the context of multinational pharma, where there's a $1 trillion market, the global health vaccine market is relatively small, And, well, the vaccine market is relatively small, and the global health vaccine market within the vaccine market in general is smaller still. And so this creates actually, I think, a real disincentive for multinational corporations to be involved in vaccines, despite the fact they have this very outsized impact on health. And more importantly, where they have that outsized impact on health is in the poorest of the poor. So this slide just really shows that most of the kids that are born in places where there's very little revenue are the kids that have the greatest potential impact for vaccines. And so this, to me, is a huge tension for the vaccine R&D ecosystem, and something that I think really needs to be addressed with real creative ways of thinking about how we move forward. So those were just some slides I wanted to provide as framing, and I will stop there.
Yeah, thank you, Lynda. These are really important slides. Clearly, one reason for underinvestment below the social optimum is the ability to pay by populations who can benefit from vaccines. Would you start us off with a few more thoughts on discovery and how can we stimulate through Gates funding, through other mechanisms, discovery of vaccines that benefits populations without ability to pay?
So, yeah, so I was asked to speak to sort of innovation and discovery and development. And I think one of the things to realize is that vaccines are not easy products to develop. It's a long game, and it requires a certain amount of resilience, optimism, and a huge amount of patience to bring a vaccine from discovery through to licensure. But I think there's a lot of progress, and I think we should actually be enthusiastic about where we are. And I really do hope that if we can be smarter about how we develop vaccines, that we could actually make much more rapid progress. So what I wanted to do is maybe highlight two areas where I think we have made real scientific breakthrough, which, if those could be translated to impact, would have transformational effects on the vaccine R&D. And then one area where I think we're not doing a good job. So historically, how we used to create vaccines was almost entirely empirical. We really had very little idea of what we were doing or how we were trying to protect people. And I really think that, this has changed. Over the past 10 years, we have a huge amount of basic science understanding of human immunology, pathogen biology, that really allow us to rationally design vaccines. I think, this really being underpinned by some advances in, as an example, how we monitor the human immune system. We now can use next-generation sequencing to deeply sequence immune repertoires and understand all of the antibodies that a person makes. And then additionally, we also understand the pathogens better. We understand what the receptors they use to invade, how we can block those receptors, and how we can intervene in those infections. And, this has led actually very recently to a whole field of vaccinology called structure-guided immunogen design, where we can now actually take proteins and design them optimally to improve the type of immune response we get. And this was really just a theoretical thing until the work that was led by the NIH, by Peter Kwan and Barney Graham, looking at a new immunogen for RSV called DSCAV1. And that immunogen actually now, when it has just gone into humans, and we now have human proof of concept, is actually orders of magnitude better at driving protective antibody responses. And I think that approach actually is an approach that we could really leverage for a whole bunch of other vaccines, HIV, malaria, and so on. So that's one area where I feel that there's been significant advance. The second area I really want to highlight, and I think particularly important in the context of Germany, is the potential for nucleic acid vaccines. So Germany has really led the forefront of this idea that with companies such as CureVac and BioNTech, that we no longer need to make proteins and put them into people, but we can actually use the genetic code, and by using the genetic code, we inject the genetic code in, and then people make the vaccines themselves. And this has some enormous advantages. It allows you to do rapid prototyping and discovery. It has really opened up a world for cancer vaccines that we've not seen for neoantigens, and also is an opportunity for combinations. The other thing about the sort of mRNA vaccines is in the downstream space, there are also opportunities in that the manufacturing plants are potentially much smaller, and these small footprint manufacturing facilities really have much lower capex. You can make vaccines, therefore, potentially much cheaper. You can have pandemic response, and really it offers a new model potentially for regional supply of vaccines. And I think there are other examples where this sort of paradigm might start taking hold, but it will require a lot of system strengthening in the regulatory and framework within developing countries. So the final area I'll just highlight, which I think we've actually unfortunately not made as much progress and there needs to be more innovation, is in adjuvants. So adjuvants are basically immune stimulants that you give with a vaccine to tell the body that it needs to respond. They're really essential for many vaccines to be effective. And despite that, and despite the fact that we now have a much better understanding theoretically of how these things work, we've actually not put any of that knowledge to practice. And there very, very few adjuvants exist. When they do exist, it's very hard to bring them forward through the clinic. And then when they have been de-risked, they become very precious commodities that are held very close by the pharmaceutical companies that develop them with proprietary knowledge and IP. And as such, the regulatory path for a vaccine with a new adjuvant is very, very difficult. And because of that, we don't have enough adjuvants. We don't have access to adjuvants. And I think this is really an area where we could really be much more creative and innovative, and that would really open up a lot of opportunities. So I will stop with that.
Yeah, terrific. Thank you, Lynda, for this excellent introduction into new approaches to vaccine discovery, allowing for low capex discovery and more targeted and smarter discovery, really. We'll come back to it, I think, but Frederik, I would like to hand over to you now once we have discovered a vaccine candidate, the next stages in development, clinical testing, rapid trials. What are your ideas and experiences as CEPI Deputy CEO?
Yeah, thank you, Till, and thank you for being part of this very distinguished panel. So CEPI and my comments will probably focus then on this particular case of emerging infectious diseases, and where basically the world understood that there's, or has understood for a long time, but it became very clear with the Ebola outbreak in West Africa in 2014 that the market was not really sufficient to pull vaccines through for emerging infectious diseases. And as you know, the outbreak, which caused almost 11,000 deaths directly from Ebola, and numerous others indirectly from the increased mortality from maternal and child health diseases and malaria and other diseases due to the breakdown of the healthcare system, also had a devastating impact on the economy for the West African countries, and estimated at £2.8 billion. We heard yesterday from Dr. Moeti from AFRO WHO that the world is getting better prepared, not least through the joint evaluation processes, but I think we probably all agree that we're still not fully prepared for the next potentially big outbreak. And with the increasing global warming, ecological changes, the urbanization, the increased mobility that we're seeing, we see that these emerging infectious diseases are in fact increasing year by year. And so CEPI was constructed and launched at the World Economic Forum last year in 2017 as an innovation to try to address this particular issue. And our vision as a coalition is, to help that these epidemics will still be there, but they don't develop into a threat to humanity like we have seen lately. And so CEPI's focus is to drive vaccine development from late-stage preclinical and through phase 1 and phase 2 testing so that they're ready for large-scale effectiveness trials during an outbreak. And of course, these diseases really need an outbreak, unfortunately, to have that final testing. We're also working on developing or supporting the development of novel platform technologies. So, like you were talking about, and we've had a call for proposal on that, which I'll just mention very briefly. So, the first focus we had was on diseases that are on the WHO blueprint list of emerging infectious diseases, which require more R&D. And so we chose Lassa fever, MERS, and Nipah. This was our scientific advisory committee that chose these diseases based on the probability that they could become major outbreaks, and secondly, the consequences of such outbreaks, and thirdly, not least, the probability that it was possible to develop a vaccine. And all of these three diseases have had major outbreaks just in the last few, or this year, with Lassa fever major outbreak in Nigeria. We've seen Nipah in India, and MERS, numerous cases, latest also in the UK just some weeks ago. The second call was, as I mentioned, on platform technologies, and there we are reviewing a number of very promising technologies. So we're looking at DNA-based vaccines, RNA, self-amplifying vaccines, as you spoke to. We're looking at recombinant proteins and viral vectors. And together with the specific vaccines that we have chosen and are investing in, and these new platform technologies, we expect by the end of the year we'll actually have more than 30 concrete vaccine projects under development, of which 6 will be on platforms, each of them being tested on, looking at the platform potential against 3 different pathogens for each of them. And the platform call is challenging also in trying to really change the game in terms of moving things more quickly. So from one identifies a new unknown antigen till one has a vaccine ready for trial, it should only take 16 weeks. That's the challenge we've given to our awardees. And from one gives the first dose to you actually get some sign of a clinical benefit, it should only take 6 weeks. And then if one decides to really ramp up production, to go from a go decision until 100,000 doses should take 8 weeks. So these are the challenge goals that we've given for these platform technologies. And now we had our board meeting last week and are considering both investments on Ebola and potentially looking at further down the list of blueprint diseases. And the board also opened for explorations into use of animal vaccines, which could be a beneficial strategy, for example, for MERS, which has the camels as a repository. So I'll end by just saying that all of this is really, I think our experience with this so far is the focus on the coalition of our name, and that these are really vaccines for the world, and we need to work together around them, and we have a number of mechanisms to do that with all partners involved, and I should acknowledge the strong support from Germany as one of our both founders and financiers, and other governments as well as partners here, both PATH and Gavi and the Gates Foundation, which is one of our key both founders and funders. And we're trying to sort of align for sort of the last mile delivery of these vaccines through what we call the Joint Coordination Group, where we have both WHO, Gavi, the European Medical or EMA, FDA, MSF, UNICEF, the Red Cross, Red Crescent, AVREF, and NIPSI and Wellcome Trust around the same table to try to discuss how can we really be prepared to deliver these vaccines when we need them. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, super, Frederik. Really exciting to hear that you will have these 30 platform technologies ready to go into the field. Just a very short clarification question. When you are now aiming to do effectiveness trials, once you have the platform technologies in wait, lying in wait for the next episodic epidemic arising somewhere in the world, do you have ready-made ethics already for, in a generic way, for certain scenarios, by spread, by population, by geographical location, and ready-made trials teams that can go into the field almost on a day's notice? Or how do you prepare to be very quickly in the field when a new epidemic is arising now, building on the platform technologies?
Absolutely. So I would say we don't have that ready now. We are working intensively to help develop that, but that's of course again back to this consortium idea. So WHO is leading on the clinical trials design, and through the Joint Coordination Group we have different working groups looking at these different questions, and also collaborating with the likes of EDCTP. We'll have a call next year on clinical trial capacity development in Africa for Lassa fever particularly. So I think each and every one of these diseases poses specific challenges which need specific plans, and we are at least starting to think about them.
Great. Yeah, Steve, I realize PATH covers many of the stages from discovery to population health. Would you talk to some extent about your motivation and your organization's motivation in investing in vaccine and vaccination technology, and also maybe supply chain and manufacturing solutions that are novel?
Sure. Well, thank you. And thank you for inviting us to this panel and being on such a great stage. I guess maybe from the the newest member of the vaccine to PATH, I may be one of the oldest people up here, but we're certainly the oldest institution up here. Have been around about 40 years doing work in innovation in global health across essential medicines, but also tools and devices and a lot of system work through partnerships around the world. And in that work, vaccines has become a central piece of our work, and quite an extensive portfolio of projects. And we, certainly I don't think need to sell to this audience the reasons, which are, of course, effectiveness in cost effectiveness, a prevention tool, a way to address equity. PATH is a nonprofit, so we focus entirely on our mission, which is to use innovation to address inequities in global health. But also there's some new issues and new ideas coming up, which I'm pretty excited about in terms of innovation, new types of partners, new types of data models that can help us, and then certainly new issues like AMR that I'll speak to. We may be the oldest up here, but it might be the least familiar, so I might just tell you a little bit about what we've tried to do with our vaccine work, which would explain a little bit of how I fit into this stage. I mean, first of all, we are partners to Gavi and to the foundation and to CEPI and others, but have often focused much more on the diseases that are paramount around the world that are not necessarily in this emerging category. And I think it is an important note to kind of remind folks that we have in fact seen a lot of interesting energy and work coming out of the Ebola crisis to start thinking differently. We've been very active on the ground and in the lab but we are continually saying, let's not forget that far more people are dying of diseases we already know about, like malaria and TB and pneumococcal and rotavirus and rota and other things. So we need to keep an eye on that. PATH, when I came in about 6 years ago, we had about 56 vertically funded vaccine projects, either development or introduction. And it made not a lot of sense to me. So one of the business innovations we did is sort of flip that on its side and created a center that had more cross-cutting functional capability and a real vaccine development and introduction platform. And now we have a couple dozen candidates that we're working actively on across 17 different pathogens and with multiple funders, including the Gates Foundation and CEPI, but the German government and others, for which we're very thankful. PATH has been a central part of many, many vaccine stories and successes, MenA, Japanese encephalitis, the RTSS malaria vaccine, the pneumococcal. So we have actually been part of and helping orchestrate driving innovation all the way through to registration and uptake and delivery. So we think a lot about that sort of end-to-end model, and that was one of the reasons we set up this structure, so we could actually build for a variety of different reasons. We had more agility and flexibility to respond to changes in the market, where we could try to avoid abandoning assets as much as we often did, where we'd end a trial for one disease and then all that trial structure would go down and then we'd rebuild it for another disease. And how could we try to overcome that challenge? How we could use our teams around the world, where 1,000 of our folks sit in Africa and Asia thinking technical questions about upstream models, how we could actually enable more end-to-end thinking in our vaccine development and design. And then how could we ensure that delivery was also part of the puzzle? So PATH also has worked extensively on delivery tools, everything from the Uniject device, the solo shot syringe, the vial monitor, all came out of PATH's labs and working now with industry partners. So that was sort of the thesis, is like in the world of vaccines, where we have so many critical vaccines that are either unavailable because the science isn't there, or they're too expensive for the global public market. How do we help ensure access and affordability for all of those? There is a really ripe time in right now in the innovation space in vaccines, and I won't repeat what Lynda and Frederik said, because it is about not only new science and new models, but new manufacturing capabilities that I think over time we'll see the cost curve go down and nimbleness arise as we get more effective at getting to manufacturing models that are more adaptive. I also think one thing that we haven't talked yet on here is the new world of data tools and data technology is going to be profound in this space. Not only already are we seeing where we can think about precision health and medicine as to where we understand populations better, we know how to target them, we can think of supply differently, but clearly the work in data and digital tools in delivery and tracking and tracing, which I know Seth will talk more about, but that's a critical piece of the puzzle. We've been working extensively on that group, on that work with data and digital tools, and just actually entered a partnership with the WHO on helping transform digital health systems around the world. One of the biggest things that's happening as well is the conversation and awareness and evidence about antimicrobial resistance and what AMR means for vaccines. And of course, I don't need to probably tell this audience again that this is a critical phase of where global health needs to pay some more attention and to think about different models, different economic incentives, but also new tools, and vaccines as a critical tool. I mean, you just have to think of what's happened recently with typhoid in Pakistan, knowing that resistance is developed, and what we can do with the TCVs and new vaccines to get ahead of the need for repeated first and second line drugs. And that's not only in typhoid, but it goes across a set of diseases: Shigella, TB, malaria, pneumonia. We know that there's vaccines as a part of that, and so it's very important. So I would end with just saying, I think there's a lot going on. There's a lot of need for better coordination. We have a lot of players in this space, which is a great thing, and we have a lot of problems to solve, so the more people engage, the better, but we need to keep sort of figuring out how we coordinate better, how we're not repeating each other's work, how we build on each other's work. I think CEPI and PATH have been very engaged in how do we work together with parallel work. We have a relationship, we support each other, we've helped each other hire people, we've done some interesting work to make sure that we really are being part of one big ecosystem, not a complicated one. I think we have to figure out how better collectively to take advantage of these new tools and data models. I think that is the game changer in global public health in the next decade, and there's so much we can do both on the R&D side but on the downstream side. I think that we also have to address a large challenge, which I will just put out there and not spend time on, but there is a emerging challenge called sometimes the second valley of death, or that once we get vaccines, a lot of energy on the early stage, preclinical, early work, but once they get to about 2A, there is not a lot of capacity or, more importantly, funding and financing to take vaccines forward all the way through to, registration and important uptake and delivery. And that's creating a challenge for industry's engagement, because they're like, I don't think we should be on the hook for it all forever. It's changing a challenge for the global health community, how we think about supporting that. And that's one of the biggest issues we've got to address over the next decade. Thanks.
Thank you, Steve. Could I ask one small question? So I like your idea of precision public health, utilizing new data models to know where to target, if I understand you correctly, and know where to go first and prioritize communities and populations for vaccination initiatives. Is there a new concept of herd immunity potentially emerging, right? So we have herd immunity as a very crude idea in standard epidemiology, and we could probably be much more precise in knowing how to maximize, given constrained resources, the amount of protection of others we are achieving through vaccinations.
Yeah, I'm sure others on the panel could answer that question better than I can. I do think we know in other work we're doing how even in, say, malaria control and elimination, and this will be important as we go into trial the pilot studies for various cohorts on the malaria vaccine, is we've seen on the control and elimination work that if we can use better population data tools, actually machine learning to layer in meteorological data tools, that we're actually able to pinpoint hotspots and get to them quicker, faster, understand the scope of the problem, and then move in with the right size sort of approach. And I think as you start thinking about that, adapting it to immunization strategies, micro plans and immunization models, that will have a very important effect. Whether it changes the definition of herd immunity, I turn to my much smarter friend to the right.
So thanks for including us on the panel. And not everybody's familiar with Gavi, so let me just say a few words. Gavi was set up 18 years ago. It came out of the World Economic Forum, and the idea was we had these powerful new vaccines that could really make a difference, and we were using them in wealthy countries, but not getting to the places that needed them the most. And the idea was to create an alliance and to have that alliance bring everybody working on vaccines together. Perhaps not the most effective governance model, to Steve's point, but a way to move the whole community forward. And frankly, it's been a remarkable success, which has been helped by the fact that in 2015, Angela Merkel hosted our last replenishment right here in Berlin. And, we now have immunized, we'll announce it at the end of this year, more than 700 million additional children and prevented more than 10 million deaths. Now, the dirty truth, of course, is that we've heard about all the power of vaccines, the cost effectiveness, the cost-benefit ratio, 1:44. I mean, all of these marvelous things. But vaccines do not deliver themselves. And this is a really important point. So if you look at the global health space, vaccines are the number one tracer. Overall, 86% of the world's children have at least a third dose of a DPT-3 containing vaccine. Now, of course, if you're astute mathematicians, you realize that 14% don't. And this is really where the rub is, because what we need is to be focused on those areas. Because if you're not getting vaccines, you're not getting contraceptives, you're not getting any other treatments. And so what we need is to build resilient health systems that reach those areas. And in the old days, it was poor countries with poor health systems. That's not true anymore. And today we have to think about urban centers where populations are streaming in and moving around. We have to think about stigmatized groups. We have to think about people off the grids. And this is where some of the new technologies that Steve was talking about are so important. Because as we begin to identify the zero-dose children, those that are missed, and by the way, we've done a pretty good job looking at zero-dose children for polio. But when the polio teams came, they gave them a polio vaccine. They didn't bring them into the system to give them the protection against all the diseases that are so critical. So this is where we need to move, and this is where innovation can really make a difference. Now, on countries that are doing well, we've seen a 1% a year increase in coverage. And so we provide vaccine to 60% of the world's children, and, it's a really good story. However, in fragile countries, coverage levels are much lower and they're stagnant. And so this is going to be the challenge going forward. Look at what happened with Ebola. During the crisis, we created an advanced purchase commitment. We were able to bring vaccine forward quickly. And I was on the ground in Bandika 13 days after the epidemic began for the first injection of a vaccine. That epidemic stopped quickly. It helped that DRC was very experienced in their 9th epidemic. So, that was the good news. What's happening now? Well, it started the same way. And frankly, it was good news that it was in DRC again because they're very experienced. But what's happened? It's come bang into SDG 16. Why? Because it's moved into an area that has rebel occupation, that has security issues. So the concept of being able to do careful tracing and to be able to do vaccination of families and of contacts has not been so easy. And as a result, we're teetering on a situation where we could have another explosive outbreak spreading to other places. Now, of course, we're better off that we have tools, but again, we need those systems. So I think this is the important message to do. A second message that I think is critical is that, we've had vaccines. We're talking about new vaccines across this panel. I used to work for the Rockefeller Foundation. We won a Nobel Prize for a vaccine in 1936 against yellow fever. It's cheap, it's single dose for lifetime, and today we're still having yellow fever outbreaks because the coverage rate in the yellow fever belt is only about 45%, not being prioritized, not getting attention. And I don't need to tell the people in this audience that right here in Germany, you're having outbreaks of measles, a disease that, of course, we have good vaccines for that aren't a problem, and the anti-vaccine movement is moving forward dramatically. So we've got a set of forces that are going to be critical to the exciting innovation we heard about from Frederik and Lynda, and Steve. But how do we make sure we overcome those? We need societal vaccines and information, because misinformation about vaccines move at the speed of life. I'll just end with, the tragedy I talked about here in Germany or in Switzerland, the problem with, anti-vaccine movements. But, today we're having a big problem in Indonesia right now. And this problem is related to the fact that there's Fatah, and there's now, misinformation that gets spread around by social media. And with that, people lose confidence. And it takes a long time to build confidence, but we're in a world now where with fake news, anti-science, it is really easy for rumors to spread. And without that science base, in essence, we're all lost.
Great. Thank you, Seth. Maybe to follow up, just one question on this last mile or the third valley of death. down to the person who needs it. The 14% are, of course, a global average, and some communities will have very high percentages of uncovered children and adolescents and adults with key vaccines. Can we better leverage community health worker programs? Can we better leverage community leaders, maybe lay health workers, national immunization days? What are your innovations to get it to the person who needs it?
Yeah, so all of the above. What's interesting is that there is a movement now, as we talk about universal health coverage. You can't have universal health coverage with primary health care. So we're going to Astana in a few weeks to talk about a revitalization of that. And of course, unless you have prevention, you can't afford any of this stuff. So I think making sure prevention stays at the forefront is critical to those other issues. But for example, there's good data now. People have worked on with community health workers and been able to show you can go out and everything from just creating demand with the families or spreading good information all the way to training them to do basic use. And of course, in the innovation agenda, we haven't talked about new technologies, patch technologies to deliver heat-stable vaccines that don't need a refrigerator, et cetera, et cetera. So we can use community health workers, but also there are other new technologies. We're delivering, not we, a company is delivering blood in Rwanda by drone. When you have an accident, you text, and the blood, or if you come in hemorrhaging in childbirth, you get the right type of blood delivered. There's zero wastage. You get it in 20 minutes. It's the price of a motorcycle delivery. So I was in Papua New Guinea a few weeks ago. The coverage is awful. The geography is terrible. You could easily deliver vaccines by drones. Today they do it by helicopter with doctors and nurses. Imagine how expensive that is. You could do it by drone, but to do that, you have to set the system up and to have a set of embracing of technology, and you got to train those community health workers to do it. So these are doable things. In emergency settings, more and more we're doing, instead of going in with one antigen for a campaign, we're going in with a whole range of antigens, because we've learned, particularly in tough settings like with refugees, with the Rohingya in Bangladesh, we went and vaccinated against cholera. It was great. There was no cholera cases. We all thought we did a great job, and then they ended up with an outbreak of diphtheria in the same population. So the challenge is how do we really make sure we're getting population immunity on these diseases?
Yeah, Gayle, you have, I think, the double task to synthesize and take us into the discussion with the audience, but also maybe to stimulate our thinking on how we can be better in what Seth has started talking about, engaging with the public, with policymakers, to reinstill trust in vaccines.
Sure, I can synthesize, stimulate the whole group. Thank you very much for that. I'm not a scientist. I've worked with Seth for a long time. And I think the thing we know about vaccines is we've got measurable progress. We face considerable risks right now, and I think you just talked about them. One of them is the misinformation. The other is a sort of faddism. The development community likes to leap from one silver bullet to the next. And the third is, ironically, complacency. We can think that we're doing so well that we don't really need to focus on this anymore. I think the good news is we know how to do it, and we've got to muster the political will and the tools. When I look at this, and I come from a place where I, for 14 months, twice a day, running point on the response to the Ebola epidemic in the Obama administration, learned that if we don't run faster than these diseases, they're winning. And that's one thing I think we've all got to keep in mind all the time. The second is I had the advantage of having one foot in that field and another in the other. Some of the things that Seth spoke to, the broader development agenda, whether there is war and peace, how an economy is working, whether you have infrastructure. And I think if I would say one thing to all the powerful voices and experts on vaccines is we would love to work with you to get out there more. Because I think it's when we get out of our stovepipes or cylinders of excellence, as I like to call them, and collaborate across sectors, that's where I think we can make some real changes. And let me give you a couple of examples. When I think of the big constraints, and Lynda, your slides were quite powerful in driving this home, it has to do with access and equity. And if you look at what we're seeing in R&D, it's borderline criminal when you when you think about it, is so upside down. But I think there are ways that we can redefine revenue potential. If you work with economists, one of the things we learned in, for example, getting girls into school is you can correlate that to GDP. You can show that countries grow in measurable ways if girls are in school. Arguably, we can show that there is massive revenue potential in utilizing vaccines and vaccine coverage. We know it, but I think we've got to go out there and show it. Like the second is on this thing that sounds so deadly boring of health system strengthening. Trust me, as somebody who's been in government and now leads an advocacy organization, this is not a slogan to win hearts and minds, right? Strengthen health systems now. It doesn't get people. But I think we know that where there are holes in the net, these diseases sneak through, and unless and until we don't have any holes in the net, we're not going to see the returns we want. And, you know, occasionally that gets played with respect to the risks in global pandemics like Ebola. So what do we do about this? When I think about how do we go faster than these diseases, what are some of the accelerators that I think we ought to think about? One is obviously science and continued investments in science. I hate to say in some cases the defense of science. But importantly, I was glad, Lynda, that you mentioned the National Institutes for Health or research that's being done here, or IAVI, the International AIDS Vaccine Initiative. Research by diverse entities and steady supplies of resources for research and science. Innovation, but innovation at scale. This zip line that you're talking about in Rwanda is extraordinary. I don't think it would be that hard to get all the powers that be in the global health community, in the business community, and say, how do we make sure that gets in the pipeline of systems all over the world? Otherwise, we're going to do it one country at a time, and we're going to still move slower than these diseases. So it's innovation, but then how do we partner with those who can get us to scale? It's the market. You mentioned having an advanced purchase commitment. These can work, but they're not going to work if we do them as one-offs. How do we think about market interventions that can be systemic and long-term? There are plenty of people around the world who know how to play the market. I've read that. I think it's true. We can certainly figure out how to do the equivalent of a long-term strategic advanced purchase commitment. Another accelerator is goals. We've got the Sustainable Development Goals out there. They are ambitious and huge and audacious, but they focus the mind. We've seen in Africa, for example, where the AU has adopted goals on health, and we're hoping they'll revise those, but where they've got goals on agriculture, on other things, there's an incentive to try to meet those goals. But the last one, surprise, surprise, I come from an advocacy organization, is citizen engagement. And I say that as the president and CEO of the One campaign, but also as somebody who has been either the customer or the victim of One and many other advocacy organizations in my time in government. It is when decision makers know that there's a public demand for these kinds of interventions, for the development assistance that will fuel them, for the collaboration that will allow for systemic APCs, that's when you get the results. So I think the last appeal I would make is that all of us work together much more, and that those of you who are driving on the specific of vaccines, find those advocates who can help you get out there and make the case to those who are ultimately going to make the decisions about whether we go faster than the diseases or they beat us.
Yeah, thank you, Gayle. Excellent way to stop. I think I would like to start us off in a discussion and then hand over to you for questions to our outstanding panel, which is really an opportunity to have this much brain power on one stage on vaccines, from discovery to end frontline delivery. So please think about a few questions to ask in a few minutes. I would like to start us off. So we have BARDA, we have CEPI, We have probably global initiatives now that can deal in the future with emerging episodic diseases. Do we do enough? Clearly, we also have Gavi and other institutions, but do we do enough for the entrenched endemics, TB, malaria, rheumatic heart disease, at the institutional level, but also, and you've mentioned, Gayle, advanced purchase commitments, these more mechanistic, these little tools that we have. My impression is always they're not answering really, or they're not completely fulfilling their promise, but that may be because we're not using them in the right ways. Advanced purchase commitments, scientific prizes. I'm a scientist. I would love to compete in a grant competition or for a scientific prize to manage to vaccinate rural and remote populations in Swaziland that are still not getting EPI vaccinations. Do we do enough with those incentives and structures? And patent pools, technology transfer hubs, so these mechanisms, these smaller devices that we have at our control and could use to address endemics with vaccines.
Let me just first add one point to Gayle's wonderful summary, and I think the other critical piece is building political support at country level. And one of the lovely things we're seeing, we require, and this is important for people to hear, we require that every country, no matter how poor, pays something. And the reason for that is not necessarily that amount of money is so big, but it means that the Minister of Health has a conversation with the Minister of Finance, and they begin to put a budget together, and that budget over time, as they get wealthier, increases. And so we're seeing now a record spend from countries on their primary healthcare systems, on vaccines, and that's really important. We've had 16 countries transition out of Gavi. They're all paying for all their vaccines. And so, what we need to do is make sure it's not just in the West and getting people excited, but it's globally that we get people excited. But to go to your question, I think there are lots of ways to use these instruments. So I talked about an advanced purchase commitment, but a better example is an advanced market commitment. So when the pneumococcal vaccine originally came out in the West, it was a 7-valent vaccine that didn't cover the strains in the developing world. Companies began to work on those anyway, but Gavi was able to put out with its donors an advanced market commitment for that vaccine. And within 5 years, the vaccine went from not being in the developing world at all to being in 54, 55 countries, today 57 countries. And the price went from a price in the United States of around $600 to a course in developing countries of under $9, making it therefore, obviously still an expensive vaccine, but affordable. And what's interesting is that plays out then in the issue of looking at antimicrobial resistance, because with full immunization with pneumococcal vaccine, it's estimated that you would prevent more than 11 million days of antibiotics. And you mentioned rheumatic heart disease. Here's a really interesting one. Rheumatic heart disease is a disease of developing countries, mostly now poor countries. It still causes about 150,000 deaths. You could argue that's important as a target, but it may not be an economic target. But the only way to prevent rheumatic heart disease is to treat group A strep sore throats with antibiotics. There are 650 million cases of group A strep, not to mention all the misdiagnosed cases. And if you have 10 days of antibiotics, that's 6.5 billion patient days of antibiotics you're giving. So when we value that vaccine, is it a vaccine against those countries and those deaths in those countries, or is it a vaccine against that 6.5 billion patient days of antibiotics? And if you add misdiagnosed and everything else, maybe it's 10 billion patient days of God only knows what antibiotics. So this is the way we have to think going forward on this.
So maybe I could comment on your question around the efforts around endemic vaccines rather than emerging, and whether we have our balance correct. I think emerging pandemics and so on are clearly high priority. They focus the mind, and they've rightly got a lot of attention because of the collapse of the healthcare systems that we see around them when they do occur. But I do think that we haven't focused enough, or, around the endemic vaccines such as TB, malaria, and HIV. And I think they all, for different reasons, have a sort of reason for urgency. Clearly malaria, if we really, we've seen a plateau in the number of malaria deaths. Our current interventions are just not doing what they used to do and getting to where they need to get to. With TB, a large proportion of the world is latently infected, and we're never going to interrupt transmission unless we do something there. And with HIV, to me, this is the biggest sort of ticking time bomb. If you look at the population dynamics and demographics of sub-Saharan Africa, if we do not come up with a good HIV intervention, we are in real trouble. Because, I think some of the estimates are by the year 2050, 50% of the population of Africa is going to be less than 25 or something. So there's going to be a massive bulge, and this is a huge, just sort of ticking time bomb crisis that we really need to focus on.
Could I just address your question maybe slightly more generally, in the sense that there are two elements. One is, who should actually answer that question? And because I'm thinking about the dynamic between sort of the global mechanisms like CEPI and the national responsibilities. And I think indirectly we've been talking about it, but I just wanted to put the focus and highlight the importance of having good national decision-making systems for making those priorities. And it goes both between the types of diseases, because of course things vary from country to country and region to region. The other is also even for the types of innovations we're talking about. I was in my previous life working a lot on mobile health innovations, and countries get inundated with new sexy proposals. I'm not saying that things like drones and can definitely revolutionize the distribution system, but we again maybe helping countries to really have the decision-making power and have the analysis power to do these things. So going back to the data elements, and I think one group there which is really important is the parliamentarians, and to help strengthen the knowledge base and the ability to take these responsibilities at the national level.
I don't have much to add other than I think the only answer is no, we're not doing enough. That we have a lot of opportunity, I think, over the next decade to accelerate the advocacy work on both the emerging epidemic type and the more endemic disease areas. There's a lot of the science that we can move forward faster, and I think there's been some new commitments in TB and malaria and some new trials, et cetera, that I think are promising that we should feel that. But I think the question of how to push innovative financing mechanisms is really terribly important for the vaccine community over the next decade. Again, there's gaps along the funding cycle that are needed to be addressed. There are mechanisms that need to be rethought. There are some new types of, that I think we could accelerate some of the models that have worked in the past. And so I think that would be, I find it's interesting at PATH, we are a couple thousand people working mainly technically, and when you get the leadership together in a room and you ask, what's the gap that you would like to see us, provide more with our limited amount of unrestricted money, it's almost entirely give us more health economists to help us understand how to move the market forward with our technical, and I think that the gap is we need more of that thinking to get integrated into the scientific work.
Can I say one quick? Just one quick thing to that. I was a big advocate of APCs and AMCs when I was in government. One of the things I often heard from people was, well, there isn't enough evidence to show that these really succeed. Now, the vaccine community is one that spends a lot of time looking at evidence, and I think in the same way that there's been the quest to accumulate the evidence to show that a given vaccine works or a delivery method works, building the body of evidence on what financing mechanisms work is going to be absolutely key. And I think you need health economists to do that, but you also need economists that know nothing about health, because those are the ones that are often the most skeptical.
Well, and understanding better the things that aren't working. So there's a lot of rhetoric, and I teach this, and I love some of the innovative financing work, but there's also a lot of confusion and rhetoric around there, and I think we need to get sort of most proof cases, both positive and negative. Yep.
Yeah, I was going to say there is evidence, but I want to come back to what Lynda said, and it's important because, the timeline for cracking science problems. I mean, as you know, I spent a lot of my life focused on trying to solve HIV vaccines. It's interesting. We brought the concept forward of broadly neutralizing antibodies and immunogens that could stimulate those. Lo and behold, this last week, one of the first examples of a designer antigen against this was brought forward, from somebody that I hired 8 years ago. That's the timeline it takes. So I agree, we have to learn to accelerate it, but we also have to have patient capital that allows us to stick with these approaches over the longer time, because sometimes the science is going to be so difficult, we're going to need to create new science. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's going to be use a vaccine platform that worked for other things and just stick the antigen in and we're off to the races. But I think that's really the challenge we have.
Great. So this is your opportunity now. Yes. In the first row. How are we doing this?
Thank you. I am Christopher Bazivamo, coming from the East African community. For those who do not know, East African community is a regional economic community in an integration process for 6 countries, those 6 being Rwanda, Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, Burundi, and the Republic of South Sudan. So they are moving in a common market and in a single customs territory. The region, first of all, on behalf of them, let me thank the Republic of Germany for the strong support when it comes to immunization program. Gavi, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, for the support they have been actually giving to the community partner state for the last years. I have understood Gavi is now in a process of phasing out, which is not the time, because when we see the situation on the ground, we are not yet ready. But the decision at regional level, at partnership state level, is to promote local pharmaceutical manufacturing, including vaccines. And policies are already in place. The decision from the head of state has been taken, and we are in this move of promoting this production. And my question here is, what could be helpful for you so that you are part of a process, come and help for this new development, and avoid actually you to be on the other side of the process? What do you think could be important so that you are really supporting this process? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the excellent question. Seth, you ended us on the long-term view in discovery and development. This is potentially another long-term view, capacity locally for manufacturing vaccines in countries that currently don't yet have the capacity to do so.
So 2 comments. First of all, you'll be glad to know that there are many countries you mentioned that we're not leaving any time in the near future. So it's as countries grow wealthy, they pay more and more until eventually they transition. But many of the countries in your region will be with us for the next 20, 25 years in current projections. So just to be clear about that. I think this is a very complicated question. For drugs, I could produce drugs in my garage, I'm overstating this, and as long as it was chemically pure, and met those standards, I could argue that this is a drug that could be used. Vaccines are biologic product, living products, and therefore the process part of it is what you regulate. And so what's needed are super strong regulatory agencies, independent strong regulatory agencies, and then the question is going to be the cost of plants are huge. So the West African community, of course, can afford it if it wants to and has the political will, which you're saying. The one question that's going to be asked, though, is will it be cost effective? Because the cost of vaccine production is not in human capital, it's in equipment, it's in, the standards, and those are the same globally. And the challenge is going to be you're going to have to compete on the global marketplace with places that are producing hundreds of millions of doses to start. So this is a complicated question, and I know there's now a movement across many regions to produce their own vaccines. Of course, we want to support the countries that do that, but we also want to make sure that they understand the economics of doing that, because we're talking about an expenditure of $1 to $2 billion over the course of 10 to 15 years to produce a product initially that will not be cost effective. So this is the challenge we have. But with our partners in the alliance, including PATH, including WHO, including the Gates Foundation, we are there to help any country who makes this commitment and wants to do it. But we first want to make sure they go in with their eyes wide open.
And I would just add that about the complexity, that it's also, there's experiences globally happening as we speak with a great number of manufacturers in different developing world contexts are building capacity and experimenting different types of models for that capacity. And so I think one of the, to your question, what are steps along the process would be to really, have someone really help understand what's happening in Vietnam, what's happening in India, what's happening in Indonesia and Brazil and South Africa, and where there are different models being tested for local vaccine development.
Can we ask some questions here?
Yes, over there.
Do you really believe that you can control emerging pandemics in Africa from the outside with an approach that when a disease pops up in London, Paris, or New York, like Ebola or Zika, and then start treating it? We are talking about Ebola. There are out about 20 different hemorrhagic diseases which kill on a similar way, very quickly. So no pandemics arise at the moment. Do you really think that without building up local capacities to develop vaccines, to produce vaccines, research in vaccine, you can manage it from outside? To build a vaccine plant locally with a single-use approach costs you about 20 to 40 million, not more. Yeah? What is important and what is very expensive? The research part. Yeah? But do you really believe that you stay outside from Africa and you are able to resolve this problem?
So I think that was a question to me. And I'm sorry if I get the impression that we will solve this from the outside, because that's clearly not the plan at all. And of course, CEPI has been set up to try to address these challenges across the globe. So some of these diseases are in Asia, some are in the Middle East, of the ones that we've chosen the first. Having said that, as I mentioned, we're collaborating now with the EDCTP to prepare for clinical trials in West Africa. We're also starting to plan for epidemiology studies, again, building fully on the local research capacity. So I think a lot of the preparatory work to being able to hopefully be able to support also the treatment down the street, is to strengthen local research and development capacity. That is the way that we are working with this, and in partnership with the WHO, with the WHO Afro countries, with the national countries, to have the plans ready for their handling of these challenges. Our small support in this is really to incentivize the global research community to have sufficient funds to take products from late preclinical stage through phase 2, which is, the first valley of death. But of course, you're pointing to a very important point, which is really addressing these epidemics is a much bigger issue, which requires collaboration on a totally different scale and under the leadership of the WHO in particular, I would say. The question was whether we could do research without local production in Africa. The answer is yes. We might disagree on that, but my understanding is that we can, get products ready to a level and then make them available, as has been happening in DRC with the Ebola outbreak, where, thanks to Gavi's commitment and Médecins Sans Frontières and the protocols being ready and the national government being in charge, the products are being delivered from the US and being utilized and getting the evidence.
Can we ask questions here in the room?
Yeah, please. Okay, yeah, over there and then over there.
Robert Sebag, I am infectiologist in Paris, France. We have seen two definitions of innovation in this session. One is today and another one is tomorrow. But what about today? And thank you, Seth, and thank you, Steve and Gayle, about today. We have existing vaccine today and how to improve. When I see, and you give the example of yellow fever, only 45% of the population with a vaccine available. What about my country in France, where we die from measles, in Germany? And when you see a government in Italy, they want to stop the mandatory immunization for the population. And what is the example we give to the poorest country in the world? And I think innovation is also to find the way to make some lobbying in the level of political people in the developed country, because the suspicious of vaccine today, I am really afraid. Now the people, they're afraid about vaccine, not afraid about the diseases. And the fear of vaccine replaces the fear of diseases. And I think it's a very important challenge. Okay, R&D is important, but R&D is tomorrow. What about today? It's why I wanted to raise this topic for this group. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Who wants to take it?
Well, I think we've all commented on that one way or the other, that there's a very, very urgent question about, what this movement to create different versions of the truth, to create versions of falsehood around vaccine and vaccine effectiveness, that we have to stop in its track. And then it hasn't been helped by some, situations in the Philippines and others that have really pivoted people thinking. So I think there's three things I'd answer. One is we need more advocacy and voice, as Gayle made a very clear statement around. I think number two is I don't think one should misunderstand that a lot of us and a lot of the global health community are spending a lot of time on today, on current vaccines that we need to ensure get to the people that need it the most. How can we improve delivery capabilities? How can we improve cold chain? How do we, and not, with some gadget, but literally getting on the ground to figure out what that will take and how to move this forward in concert with really at the direction and support of the ministry, supporting the ministries of health. And I think there is more, we probably often don't talk about that because it's sort of not very sexy work and it's not not near as sexy as a new vaccine or a drone and other things which I think are all great. But there's a lot of people spending a lot of their day thinking about what do we do to get more vaccine introduction into the lowest resource settings in countries all around the world. And so I don't think we should kind of quite overlook the work that people around the world are doing there. And I would say the third thing is we do need to talk much more about affordability, not just access. And in my view, that access is partly affordability. So there are a lot of existing vaccines in the world that are not affordable for the public market. And we need to start working through what are the better, tools and models. And we are all doing that in a variety of ways, but affordability remains a critical part of this structure.
Just a very quick point on this topic, because it's also happened, we've seen it in northern Nigeria, we've seen it in Pakistan and other places where a suspicion of vaccines has grown very prominent. Tragically, scientists aren't the best position to make the argument. What has worked in other cases is community leaders and people that are trusted, most often from the faith community. Is what we've seen in a lot of places. It's celebrities we've got on both sides, unfortunately, of the vaccine debate in the United States. But I think it's going to take prominent community leaders that people trust and look up to making the case. I wish I could say that scientists would be strong enough to make the case, but we're in a funny time.
But we can learn, and you can coach us. And community leaders can coach us and work with us. Right?
Yeah,
so
and community leaders, I think, will get out there because all of the places Gavi works, I've seen many of them. They've seen the results, and I think they are willing advocates. But I think we've got to reach out to them to make the case wherever it is.
Just one more word. Senator Moynihan said once, you're entitled to your own opinions, but not your own facts. And I think the problem we have now is that science credibility across a range of issues, the science they don't like, they want to say is fake, whereas the science they like is okay. And that's not okay, because either we are a society that is based upon science and have faith in technology, or we're not. And we can't say, oh, well, I believe in this science, but I don't believe in climate change or whatever. And that is shaking right now the foundations of institutions around the world. And with that, I think we're going to see more of this problems, not just in vaccines, but in other issues as well.
I wish you were wrong.
Great. Yes, please.
Good morning. My name is Hans Hogezer. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Lancet Commission on Essential Medicines. And I would like to bring it back to affordability and research of the future vaccines. One comment and one question. I think it was mentioned once that when you have to develop a medicine or a vaccine which is not, let me say, very economically attractive because the people that need it are too poor or the communities are too poor, you call that a market failure. And we just want to make it very clear, that's not a market failure at all. It's a policy failure to rely on the market to do it. And I want to make that sure, so that it really needs government investment. Thank you. Thank you. Government investment and public not-for-profit investment to do that. But that brings us to the next issue, which is the delinking. Then you are delinking, you do the investment and the risk in the development. Does mean then that you don't need high prices to earn that back afterwards. And I know that in many public-private partnerships, there are now access plans. So already in the development process, partly with public money, there's already a plan to make it widely accessible through patent pooling, through voluntary licensing, differential prices, things like that. And for the vaccines, I think that's already there. My question is now, do you really support that? And I got a little worried when I heard about these adjuvants, where there were IP issues. And apparently what we don't want is a vaccine which is cheap, an adjuvant which is very expensive because it's under patent. So can you say something about that and the future access plans of all these newly developed products? Thank you.
So I'll just make a very small academic point that indeed it is not a market failure. Markets take the current distribution of endowments as a given, and market failures are then given these current distributions of wealth, income, and so on. And it is indeed up to public policy to redistribute and to ensure that people have ability to pay. So even in the hard science of economics in its classical form, you would not call it a market failure, right? Just a small academic point.
So maybe I could comment on the access and the IP issues, for instance, around adjuvants. So of course a vaccine is ultimately an immunogenic composition, which is an antigen and the adjuvant. So they ultimately, when you're licensing them, you can't separate the two. But this problem of not being able to access the adjuvant for other indications is a real problem. So the foundation has taken quite a strong position in the work that we fund in the upstream space around global access, which really drives towards trying to ensure, even for the earliest work we do, even when we're in blue sky, crazy stuff that's not going to hit the market for years, that we incorporate within that a global access clause to try and ensure affordability and the utilization of that funded development for our indications. Because we realize now that you can't retrofit this. You have to deal with it right at the beginning. And I think this point that you make is an extremely important point, because at the end of the day, if I can drive down the cost of the antigen, but if I can never get an adjuvant that's not going to be $10 a dose, there's nothing I can do.
And just if I can just add one point, which is sometimes, the adjuvant developed for a vaccine for use, for poor countries, like the one that was developed for RTSS and the malaria vaccine, has turned out to become, a blockbuster for a vaccine. So it went the opposite way and was able to bring huge wealth to the company because of that. The whole idea of the advanced market commitment was to solve the problem you described. So the agreement is you give us a low price now, we'll give you a top-up that you can go to your shareholders and say, I now have a guaranteed, return on investment for selling it at a low price. And then for countries, they say, okay, now we can see that this vaccine is going to be affordable over the long term, so we'll take it. We need more deals like that, and we can adjust the amounts in the different parts of the payment depending upon the cost and situation.
Not to sell is there an expression? Not to sell the skin before the bear is shot, we say in Norway. But what we're seeing is a great support and interest from multinational companies to actually have a dialogue, at least, on the use of adjuvants, which, as Seth is pointing to, has had success in other use cases, which can then potentially also be used for these vaccines that we are developing, which have much smaller volumes. So that's one aspect. In very general, we are also developing, and our board last week highlighted the importance of access in actually putting into our mission, and we're also developing an access policy, building pretty much on the Gates Foundation's approach to that. So.
Yeah, we have time for one more question. Over there, I think.
Hi, thanks very much. My name's Andrew Farlow. I'm an economist, and I've kind of moved in and out of this area for 15 or so years. And I was thinking, when we were looking at financing mechanisms 10 or 15 years ago, the WHO asked for our mechanisms, and we had 97 of them in this big report. And I was curious, you were talking about the importance of financing mechanisms and economic incentives and whatever. And one of the things that sort of has pulled me in and out is that often people, they cling to a particular mechanism and then they lobby for it, and it's not independently necessarily evaluated, and the mechanisms have to slot together, and they also have to be scientifically driven, not just economically driven, actually. So I was curious what you guys, especially at the left-hand side, what are you doing to sort of rigorously evaluate and work out which mechanism for which particular product or condition?
I mean, I would absolutely agree with you on the advocating for a particular thing and that doesn't work and then the whole idea gets thrown out. I think to the last comment that was made, it's ultimately a policy decision about whether governments are going to agree that as a matter of policy, vaccines need to be affordable and equitably distributed. Now, I think you can make the in principle case for that. I think you can also make the scientific and global health case for that, because if we don't do that, we're going to see a ricocheting of diseases across the globe. But ultimately, it's a policy decision that financing mechanisms are part of the equation. And then underneath it, it's the evaluation to say which fits for which vaccine. The rest of the panel would be far better equipped than I to speak to which fits with which. But I would say as an advocate, one of the things those of us who are in this space need to be doing is making the case for a policy decision that needs to be part of the design process.
And I would add, sort of taking off my path and vaccine hat, but I'm on the faculty at Stanford in social innovation, and I think there's a lot right now that we are doing to sort of sort, the global community in social innovation, to sort out these various financing opportunities and mechanisms that sort of all the rage, but not necessarily clear what even the taxonomy looks like. And so I do think that would help. I know from putting my hat back on, I actually find that we're often implored to use better social innovative mechanisms. And I've sort of said, look, we are leading a lot of product innovation. We're leading a lot in system innovation. Somebody else can do the financing of innovation. And then when they figure it out, come tell me what to do. Because there's a lot of risk, and there's a lot of tools, and there's a lot of language. And so I actually think that's an area that would be we need to keep working on. What's the evidence of where and how a social impact bond works? Where's the PRV mechanism accelerating and the prices going down? How are the different advanced market commitments making a difference in certain areas? There's a whole a taxonomy that needs to be sorted and filtered and actually showing what works for different. I don't think it's, like you said, it's throwing anything out with the bathwater. I think it's more fit for purpose for different interventions where we can be more clear, and that there needs to be a lot more work on that.
But with the political will.
Absolutely.
Because in the same way Lynda was talking about affordability, unless you build that into the model from the beginning.
Yeah, and it doesn't refute at all. It's really taking off that. I mean, it's really more getting into the weeds of which of those pieces do you push on. Yeah.
But just to let you know that when we, the people doing these, look at them, we ask the question, what's the problem we're trying to solve? Then what's the right mechanism? But sometimes the donors community say, wow, that was great. We did this mechanism. We really like this mechanism. Why don't you do another one of those mechanisms? Then you have to say, that's not the way it works. It really should be driven by the need, not by the success or failure of the previous mechanisms.
Yeah.
So I do realize we are just getting going and it's starting to get even more exciting, but we are out of time. I realize there were questions here. I hope the speakers will stick around a little bit, and apologies that we didn't get to all the questions. Please approach the speakers if they have a few minutes to stay with us and you. Thank you to you, and thank you Lynda, Frederik, Steve, Seth, Gayle. I'm leaving inspired and encouraged. We have policy solutions, we have technological innovations, and I think a bright future despite many of the obstacles, including social injustice, which is underlying many of it. Yeah.
Vaccine we need now?
Yeah, the social aspect.